So I'm at USC, University of Southern California, but I got my graduate degree from UCLA. I spent 5 years here as a grad student in the 1990s at a time when the EVT movement was taking off. Empirically validated treatments is what we called it at the time. And I was learning CBTs because that was the orientation of my program, deeply steeped in it. We were seeing clients taking coursework, and this EVT stuff was starting to enter into our coursework. Antonio Polo, a fellow student of mine at the time in the 1990s, working with John Weiss, we liked the orientation. That's why we chose UCLA, in part this whole CBT thing. But we were also seeing diverse clients, and we were, Antonio was a Mexican American, I'm African American. We knew that culture was relevant. We were seeing diverse folks, and so we were doing implicit things in our practice as grad students that we knew were relevant and important when working with these populations. So we liked the EVT thing, but we also felt that something was missing, and there wasn't enough discourse around culture. And at the time we held, I guess, in our minds we had this sort of cultural responsiveness hypothesis mindset. I'm going to kind of outline it for you very quickly. The culture responsiveness hypothesis basically argues that there are a number of problems when it comes to providing services to ethnic minority populations. There are problems with conventional therapies that are developed primarily by whites, Euro-Americans, Western English-speaking folks. The majority of clinicians are white in real-world settings, and particularly in research-based settings. And these interventions generally don't consider the worldviews, the language issues, the belief systems, et cetera, of culturally different folks. And when you ignore culture, lots of bad things can happen. You have values conflicts and miscommunication. Clients are less comfortable in the context of treatment, the argument is. You have poor engagement, and if they're not properly engaged, there's going to be dropout and treatment failure. So if you don't then adapt or take culture into account in a significant way, if your interventions aren't culture responsive, the argument goes, then you're not going to get optimal outcomes with ethnic minorities. So being good students of John Weiss, we decided to do something called a meta-analysis to try to aggregate the literature, find all the randomized trials that we could find focused on ethnic minorities, and to answer some basic questions regarding therapy with ethnic minorities. So these are the questions that we had. Are EVTs effective with ethnic minorities? Well, we thought, sometimes maybe, but more often not, because they're not developed for minorities. Do white youth benefit more from minorities, and white adults, for that matter, from the same treatments compared to minorities? And of course, whites would benefit more because these interventions were developed for them. And do cultural adaptations enhance outcomes for ethnic minorities? This was a no-brainer for us. Well, spending years working on this, we found that our assumptions were not quite correct. And we were surprised by our findings. We were humbled by them, and it's caused me to be more reflective and critical when I think about my assumptions when it comes to culture with respect to ethnic minorities. So today, I'm going to try to answer some questions for you very briefly based on work that we've done in my lab at USC and work that other researchers around the country have done. Are treatments effective with ethnic minorities? Are treatment outcomes worse for minorities compared to Euro-Americans? Does cultural tailoring enhance outcomes when it comes to treating ethnic minorities? Does culture matter? And how do you best address diversity in the treatment context? So first question, are therapies effective with ethnic minorities? So for this, I need to spend 30 seconds explaining meta-analysis to you, and it'll be really quick and I hope pretty straightforward. It's basically a quantitative review of the psychotherapy literature with a particular population. So we found all of the randomized trials that randomly assign folks to get an intervention or placebo or nothing or services as usual, and then compared outcomes at the end of treatment. at post-treatment or follow-up. And then we created something called an effect size. An effect size is basically where you take the average treatment outcome for those in the treatment condition, and you sort of subtract from that the average effect for the control condition. And you divide by something called the standard deviation, which I'm not going to get into. And you have something called an effect size. And for our purposes, think of it this way. An effect size of 0.8 is good. We want that. That's large. We want a large treatment effect. If someone's coming to see us for psychotherapy, we want there to be a robust, positive effect. Medium is pretty decent also. In fact, most standard psychotherapy outcome studies or meta-analyses show that psychotherapy has about a medium effect on clinical symptoms. And then 0.2, and so medium effect is about 0.5, and 0.2 is a small effect. So that's okay, but not that impressive. So 0.2 small, 0.5 medium, 0.8 large. So this is what we found in some meta-analyses that we've carried out over the past few years. Some that are published already, some that are kind of in progress, and others that are kind of in press about to be published. So basically, psychotherapy with ethnic minorities is effective. And here we break it down by Asian Americans. It's what we're just about to submit this one for publication. We find the largest effect for our meta-analysis with Asian Americans. We found about 24 randomized trials focused on Asian Americans with mental health problems. And then the smallest effect we found was for ethnic minorities construed broadly who have drug-related problems. And then in a paper that we published in Annual Review of Clinical Psychology a few years ago, we took all the data that we had for about 140 randomized trials, and we just kind of threw it together and kind of aggregated it in a sort of quick sort of way. And this is what we found. So for anxiety-related problems, treating minorities, ethnic minorities broadly with a broad array of anxiety-related problems, you get a pretty large effect size, 0.7. Same with schizophrenia. But then miscellaneous other substance use, it's on the smaller side, medium, small. But overall, if you aggregate across all of these problems, you get about a medium effect size. So generally, therapies are effective with ethnic minorities if you look at the extant research. In fact, there are probably at least 50 some odd evidence-based treatments that focus primarily on ethnic minorities. And they've got all sorts of labels. They're not just CBTs, they're family-based interventions, they're interpersonal psychotherapies, they're interventions that I've been somewhat skeptical about historically, play-based therapies without any sort of CBT component. The data's pretty strong on play therapies. They work pretty well generally for kids with behavior problems and emotional problems, and they work pretty well with minorities, youth who have behavior problems. Interestingly enough, modality doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. A number of folks have argued that, well, when you're working with minorities, you should work with the family or work in group settings because it allows you to bring the cultural context into the therapy session. But when you look at those studies that do these head-to-head comparisons of a family-based intervention versus a one-person version that's structured very similarly, you don't see much of a difference in terms of outcomes. So next question. Are treatment outcomes worse for ethnic minorities compared to Euro-Americans? And we looked at this in a number of ways. We did our own review. Bill Miller did a review also focused on ethnic minorities with drug-related problems. And then we did sort of a meta-analysis of other meta-analysis. So kind of like a mega-analysis. So we looked at all, 4 minutes, okay. Well, wow, I am going to breeze through the rest of this. But let me just tell you quickly that generally, this research suggests that ethnicity doesn't matter that much. So most of the studies show that ethnicity doesn't moderate effects. And when it does, sometimes minorities benefit more, other times whites benefit more. But overall, it's sort of like a wash. And then does cultural tailoring enhance outcomes? I'm going to skip that and that and that. So these are some examples of pan-minority recommendations that are given, things that people have recommended that you should do broadly when you're treating ethnic minorities. And these are things that are sort of more specific that folks have recommended for particular groups. So what does the evidence say? Well, it turns out that lots of interventions that are focused on ethnic minorities do some sort of tweaking or tailoring or modifying. In fact, the majority of published studies focused on treating ethnic minorities do some sort of adaptation. But when you do we recently did a rigorous meta-analysis where we only took those studies that did head-to-head comparisons of a standard non-tweaked intervention, like a standard CBT, and compared it to the same intervention, but that had some sort of cultural overlay, where they also added some sort of cultural tailoring or cultural adaptation to it. And we found about 10 studies that did that sort of head-to-head comparison, and we found zilch, that the culturally adapted interventions did not do any better than the standard interventions that were structured almost exactly the same way. In fact, the effect size was 0.01. And you recall from that prior slide, 0.2 is a small effect. 0.01 is nothing. It's sort of zilch. More interesting, though, was this figure here, where even though overall there's a negligible effect, you find that, well, some culturally adapted interventions do way better than the standard interventions. On the other hand, some culturally adapted interventions do worse than the standard intervention. So sometimes when you adapt, you can do a lot better. Other times when you adapt, you can maybe make things worse. So adaptation can swing both ways. Tailoring can swing both ways. And folks have theorized about this in different ways. Some have argued that, well, maybe it's about reactivity. Sometimes you do things that kind of, especially for maybe more highly acculturated African Americans or Latinos, and you try to inject culture to the therapy, and they say, hey, I'm not here to talk about culture or race, I'm here to talk about my problem. And it can kind of backfire in that way. Other folks have talked about it in terms of therapy sort of being like a zero-sum game. If you have an intervention that has particular active ingredients, maybe you need to focus head on and pretty deliberately on doing those things that we think give you the most bang for your buck. And if you spend too much time doing culture-related things, it might distract from those active ingredients. That's sort of one hypothesis. And a study by Wendy Kleier kind of highlights this, but I don't have time to get into it. So here's, but later, if we want, I can talk more about it. So quick summary. Therapies work, lots of EBTs for Blacks and Latinos in particular, and there's more research out there emerging for other groups. Minorities and Euro-Americans appear to benefit equally, and there's not a lot of evidence that cultural tailoring necessarily works. Now, in the past, I've sort of stopped here, and folks have argued that I seem to have a kind of pessimistic view about the role of culture, and I've started to add more to really highlight how I really feel about this, which is I think culture does matter. I'm going to skip that. So in this case, clearly, if you just use the conventional count sheep method to help this person go to sleep, it's not going to work, right? So we know intuitively that standard approaches are not necessarily going to work for everyone, but the question is how to do it in a way that has some support and that really works for a diverse population. So this slide just represents some work that we've done in my lab that kind of reflects different ways that we think and have shown that race matters. And over time, I've developed some sort of principles for what you do to inject or deal with diversity in the treatment context. So these are sort of kind of 8 things that I've kind of highlighted, most of which have some empirical support when it comes to working with ethnic minorities. The diversity cues. So just in terms of just doing things to reflect diversity. So if you look at this, you'll see what's wrong with this picture is that the university was trying to show how diverse they were because they know that if you want to attract minorities, then having these cues that diversity matters is important. But they did it the wrong way. They photoshopped the brother here into the picture, and they got caught. And it happened here too, where they photoshopped the gal on the right. So but the message here is tricky because diversity cues work in terms of triggering to ethnic minorities that they might matter, and you do get more engagement and more attention when you do things that show that. But then, of course, if it's not for real, once they get there and they realize that you don't care as much as you think you do, it can backfire. That's one of the messages. And my wife has a website I'm not going to show you that kind of, she has a practice in Beverly Hills where she very deliberately makes it clear to potential clients how much she values sexual orientation diversity across a broad kind of array of kind of qualities. Using sensitive language. Now, in the past, before he got elected and became our president, Trump was kind of an easy target because lots of insensitive comments he made. But Bernie Sanders, I think, was a more interesting case because he cares. I mean, he was kind of on the right side of things. He was out there marching in the 60s, but we don't have volume, so you can't hear the comments that he made that offended a lot of folks. He basically talking about if you're white, you don't understand what it's like to live in the ghetto. And so we got his sentiment, but the way he framed it, the way he sort of said it, it made it seem like, well, there aren't any poor whites. There aren't any whites who live in troubled circumstances. And blacks, by and large, are living miserable lives. So, so there's a sensitivity that didn't come through in his discourse at times that got him in trouble and alienated sort of folks. Role induction, and then finally, I'm just going to hone in on humility, an important principle that folks in the culture and mental health community are increasingly talking about. So for you baseball folks, you might kind of get the reference. So look, I know what you think you've got this stuff, but I'm telling you, walk God. So, you might think kind of, you got the skill set, but there are times when you get in the situation where you really need to sort of think about what your limitations are.